Hello, everyone. Today, Jason is here. Today, I'm going to ask him 5 major differences between Japanese and US workplace.
Yeah, so also another thing I noticed, and especially Americans who work or join a Japanese company, and especially younger ones, maybe in their 20s, one thing that they'll notice is that the pay and the promotion system is a little bit different. So I think one of the first things that Americans or foreigners, doesn't have to be American, but might notice when joining a Japanese company is compared to their home country, the salary at first seems a little bit lower compared to their home country. And I think this is often a bit of a surprise because people think that Japanese companies are very big, very famous, of course they're not poor. But it's not because it doesn't have anything to do with how much money the company has. It's more just the system that they use, I think, for the promotion-based system and how you get paid. And this kind of goes in a little bit with generalists and specialists, but for Japanese companies, I think the pay does start off lower, but then as you progress, it gets higher. And that's same in American companies. Both American and Japanese companies, as you progress in your career, you get paid more. Mm-hmm. But with the traditional, and I think this is from the lifetime employment system that was really strong in Japan. Typically, you join a company, the pay is going to be lower, your responsibility is going to be lower, but it's tied into your responsibility. And the responsibility, I think, is a little bit different with Japanese and American company, especially for a young person. Sure, as you know, in Japan, it's kind of popular to have this senpai-kohai relationship. So you kind of come in, maybe you don't know much about the job or the position, but someone who has some experience, a couple years older than you, basically kind of teams up with you and shows you how to do everything. My experience with American companies is that, of course, when you join the company, people help you. Of course, you're not alone and by yourself, but there wasn't quite as much someone to show me everything that I have to do. I kind of had more of that responsibility on myself. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, I think the responsibility is a little bit lower when you first start in a Japanese company. And because of that, the pay is a little bit lower. But of course, as you move up, the pay goes up. And this is an interesting thing that I think I noticed with Japanese companies is that, especially if you work at the same company your whole career, your responsibility goes up and your pay goes up. But then there's a point, I think, where actually your responsibility starts to go back down when you get much older or much later in your career. And that's because you've already put in a lot of work. Whereas in American companies, even the top people, they have a lot of pressure and a lot of responsibility. Mm. I always feel like if you're young, perhaps it's better to work in an American company, but when you're older, it's better to work in Japanese company. And I think that also brings me to job security. I just mentioned that, but I do think job security is definitely different because in my 7 years working for a Japanese company, I did not see anybody lost their job. Of course, some people want to quit, so they quit. But I mean get laid off. So where the company said, hey, we don't have this position here for you anymore. So, they fire them or they lay them off from the company. And in American companies, that's usual. I mean, every year people get laid off and they lose their jobs. And what's interesting too in American companies is it doesn't matter your age. So the older you get, you don't become more secure. In fact, it's the opposite, I think, in American companies. The older you get, those are sometimes the first people that get laid off because they have the highest salaries. So an American company, they can look at it and say, well, we can lay this person off and hire 2 or 3 young people for the same salary. So job security, I think, is definitely a difference between Japanese and American companies.
Thank you very much. I think you have been giving lots of examples and sharing lots of information. So you said recruitment process is different. They start as a generalist, not for a specialist, right?
Yeah.
And also you said allocating to the team to the different location is different, salary system is different, responsibility is different, and you also mentioned senpai-kohai relationship as well, yes. And job security.
Yeah, and of course, another thing that people are always that, especially that work in a Japanese company or Japanese who work in an American company, you're also going to notice that the communication is going to be a little bit different. I don't mean like English and Japanese language. I mean, the communication style is definitely different. So I learned when I worked at a Japanese company, I learned horenso, which means spinach, right? But it's a play on words because it means hokoku, renraku, sodan.
Yeah.
And at first I didn't really understand the point or the meaning of it. But working in a Japanese company, you'll definitely notice, especially if you're not Japanese, it is a lot of communication. So what they mean is, in fact, the translation for that is like report, contact, and consult, right? And so Japanese teams definitely like to have a lot of communication, a lot of team meetings. I remember sometimes I would wonder, why am I in this meeting? I'm not related to this project or this subject matter, but they often like to have many people involved. And this is to kind of share the work, share the information, keep close communication. When I was working in Japanese companies especially, I often had to, report to my team and to my boss, like, what's happening? What's the status of this project or this task that I was working on? This can be quite different in American companies where sometimes I might not talk to a team member for a certain amount of time, like a week or something like that. They don't like long meetings. And a lot of times you'll hear the expression, let's take this offline, especially that's popular today with the pandemic. A lot of our meetings are over video, over Zoom, Google Meets. And so if something is not related to everybody in the meeting, they'll say, let's take this offline, which means, okay, let's stop talking about this and let's talk about this just one-on-one. But I noticed in our working with Japanese companies, typically the meetings were much longer. It was not uncommon to have 2 or 3 hour meetings. And typically you talk about everything. I mean, each person kind of reports about what they're doing and there's a conversation around it. And of course, when you have that much communication, meetings get very long. So if you're a Japanese person who's joining an American company, you might have to get used to keeping the meetings very quick. And if you're working at a Japanese company, you might have to get used to more communication and reporting more about what you're doing than you're used to. And this probably goes back to generalists and specialists where, specialists are focused on their specific role, right? Their specific piece. Whereas when you have a generalist team, you can switch and mix people a little bit more. And that requires a lot more communication and coordination.
All right, Jonathan, thank you very much. I think it's going to be really helpful for people who probably willing to joining US company, or maybe even like people who are non-Japanese willing to join Japanese company.
I hope so.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.